And our presenter is Jamey Peavler. And across disciplines, researchers have sought to understand the optimal conditions for facilitating the retrieval process that learners must employ to locate and then use the information to engage in questions about the number of repetitions learners need, the types of tasks that elicit stronger connections, and more immediate retrieval of information, and whether there's any way to ensure this information is retrievable and retained over time. Awareness of the type, time, and level of support each practice form offers is essential in supporting instructors in effectively designing instruction. Considering how to interweave old content with new, distributing practice over time, and gradually reducing our support from promoted and guided to independent practice is key to permanent knowledge. The content we teach is critical, but practice makes it powerful. Jamey Peavler is a co-director and instructor in the Reading Science Graduate Program at Mount St. Joseph University. Before joining the foundation, providing Orton-Gillingham training for teachers across the state of Indiana. She was an instructional coach and classroom teacher for Indianapolis Public Schools for 20 years. Thank you for your service. Jamey reviews higher education textbooks and teacher licensure exams for the National Council for Teacher Quality. Jamey is a certified fellow in training with the Orton-Gillingham Academy and an International Dyslexia Association Structured Literacy Dyslexia Specialist. She currently serves on the board for the Reading League's Indiana chapter. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I am going to turn it over to Jamey. Thank you for joining us. We're so glad you're here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's excited to be a part of today, especially, having the benefit of hearing that amazing keynote session this morning. So that was a very powerful introduction to really what I hope I can build on in terms of supporting students who, even when we do identify them, instruction might not be having the impact that we would like to see. So thank you for having me. So today, what we really want to focus on is instructional design. So it's one really critical step to identify students who are struggling. But even sometimes once we find those students and we implement what we know are evidence-based practices, our outcomes don't improve the way that we would expect. And so one of the topics that has been of great interest to me as I'm working on my dissertation is how does instructional design impact student outcomes, and what can we as educators take from the fields of cognitive psychology to make that design even more impactful? So as we get started today, really these are the key objectives for our time together. So one is, when we really think about mastery and what is it that we're trying to accomplish, we can use the research by Herring and Eaton around instructional hierarchy to really gauge whether or not our students have mastered a skill. So really the question that we want to answer first is, how do we know if a skill has been truly mastered? Because oftentimes what we see from our students is they appear to master a skill during the week or the days that we're working on it. And 2 or 3 weeks from now, when we need to retrieve that skill and apply it, it's as if they've never seen it before. And that's especially common with individuals with dyslexia. They may have a very inconsistent profile of what they know and what they don't know. So we're going to start off with, how do we know if the skill is mastered so that we don't leave it too soon? That will then take us to the topic of cognitive load and cognitive load theory. And again, what we know from this field of research is we can either maximize the instruction and support students to learn information more efficiently through our design by being very purposeful around not presenting too much information at one time. So by exploring this theory, what we really want to do is answer the question of, why are some students experiencing difficulty making progress and others really don't seem to be having that same experience? even though they've all received the same evidence-based instruction. And a lot of that can be answered by understanding how we unintentionally overload students and prevent them from getting the most out of that instruction. And then that will take us to the topic of practice, which is really what I'm hoping to spend the bulk of our time with today. And it's really understanding how just providing more practice isn't usually the solution. It's the right type of practice and at the right time that matters. And so how does the form of practice that we're providing actually connect back to that idea of mastery learning? And then all of that will come together as our final conclusion around how then should we think about designing our instruction to, again, make sure that the practice types, the types of instructional goals we have for students, and the nature of the activities and our directions all align to make sure students get the most out of what we're doing. So let's really step back to who are we talking about when we're exploring this idea of not having the best outcomes for students. So I love that this morning we talked briefly about MTSS and really having this idea of a structure in which students have a framework that they're participating in that's well designed around this cyclical relationship between assessments and planning. And that process is always ongoing. And that really is the nature of an MTSS framework. It's proactive, it's preventative when it needs to be, it's responsive and diagnostic and prescriptive for students who need something different. However, even when we have a really strong MTSS framework, we will still have students who need Tier 3 interventions. And so what we know about those students is that 12% of general education students often fall into the category of needing Tier 3 interventions. Even if there's not a disability and there's no history of academic concern, we still end up with 12% of our general education students needing intensive intervention, Tier 3 level intervention. We also know that 30% of at-risk, and so the terms used by the researchers that I'm citing here, I want to elaborate on just a little bit. So at-risk is a very broad category. You might be at risk because you're moving schools frequently. You might be at risk because your language skills that you're bringing to school are either not quite developed, maybe you're learning a new language, and so they're very developed in one language and they're new in another. It could be that you're at risk because you are not in an environment where you have access to the same resources as other students. So that at-risk category is actually pretty complex. But 30% of students who are at risk fall into Tier 3 interventions. And then 50% of students with diagnosed disabilities often fall into Tier 3 interventions. And in many cases, people think, well, that would be expected. That's okay. It's not. Because if we are providing specially designed instruction, that should be happening in core Tier 1 instruction. It should also be happening in Tier 2. So just having a diagnosed disability shouldn't automatically mean that you have to be placed in Tier 3. So our goal is to make sure all levels of instruction are working for you so that you can get the most out of every piece and every minute of your instructional day. So based on the concerns and why we're ending up with so many kids in Tier 3, we need to look at what are some things that we can implement across all tiers to reduce the number of students down to what's manageable, and that is not a permanent placement for students, that they get what they need and then they don't come and get that additional support if it's working for them and it's effective. So I thought it would be helpful if we just kind of come together around some key principles of research that really inform the bulk of what I'd like to address today around practice and instructional design. So first, we know that reading science is an evidence-based research to practice direction for improving literacy instruction. And it includes research from many disciplines: cognitive psychology, linguistics, communication sciences. So the list is very comprehensive. And it's really a form of checks and balances, because having, a piece of research that says, this is really effective, that students who receive 98 minutes of one-on-one instruction every day will greatly improve their outcomes over the course of the year. Well, that might be valid, but then you need educators to go, we actually don't have the ratio to have one child to one adult for 98 minutes. So there's this constant checks and balances of the pragmatics, but also accountability of, is this evidence-based and is this something we should align our instruction to? So a couple of key resources to explore if this is an area that you would like to improve your knowledge on would be just even going back to the National Reading Panel and some of their findings, and then also the Reading League's defining guide. Another key point to connect these topics for us today are around, again, MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support. And remembering that it is a framework, it's an organizational system in which we anchor the instruction that we're planning and implementing with our assessments, and that it is constantly done in a cycle. We also know, when we're connecting the research across fields, that instructional design can either improve and enhance and maximize the outcomes for students, or we might end up creating a very clumsy and confusing process for students. So that relates again back to this idea of cognitive load. When our instruction is efficient, when it's designed around what we know works for students, then the instruction actually does have a stronger impact on their learning. But again, even when we have good design and good frameworks, there will still be students who need a little bit more. And for those students, it's important for us to implement a structured problem-solving process. And that problem-solving process adds a layer of checks and balances to that Tier 2 and Tier 3 intensification. I don't want to put students in a group where they're receiving more instruction if their needs are diverse and if the skills that they have not yet developed aren't aligned with one another. Simply putting students who have been identified as at risk in a group together and thinking that one type of curriculum or one type of intervention will meet all their needs is often why we experience situations where students are in almost a long-term placement in a tier of instruction. That's generally reflecting back to us that we may not have gone through the process of pinpointing what their unique needs were and skills were for us to target. And again, once we do that problem-solving system and we pinpoint their skill needs, then we need to think about our instructional design and what is it that that child can manage? How do we need to provide the right forms of practice to make that the most effective instruction possible? So let's start off with our first question in our objectives today, which is, what is mastery? What does it actually mean for a student to master a skill? And around each of our guiding questions today, I'm offering to you some researchers that have really contributed specifically to this field and this topic, if again, this is an area of interest to you. So a lot of the work that I'll be sharing with you around instructional design today is based on Herring and Eaton's 1978 instructional hierarchy model. And then more recently, which I think probably recently is a relative term, in 1996, Ed Daly did some additional work building on that theory and really looking at what is implementable around that theory. So let's talk about instructional hierarchy and those stages of mastery. So this quote actually comes from a text called Effective Universal Instruction. And I pulled this quote out to explain the theory because it is the most succinct definition I've seen so far. But really what it's illustrating for us is we don't have this, line in the sand where we're learning a skill and then we just kind of jump over that border and all of a sudden we've mastered. It's actually a progression through phases and stages. And what's interesting about this is, again, that's also not a really distinct piece to recognize. We're often going to have characteristics of maybe two different phases as we're transitioning from one into the other. So let me outline what those are. So the first phase towards mastery is acquisition. And in acquisition, as a new learner, I'm really pretty clumsy in my thought process. I am probably still making a lot of errors. I might leave out steps. I might need some visual and verbal reminders because I'm really trying to focus on this new information and it's very effortful for me. And for some students, that acquisition stage can be very long. Others, it might be that they learned it one time and they understand for the most part, but getting to stage 2, which is fluency, could be a little more challenging. So the difference between stage 1 and stage 2 is in acquisition. Again, my accuracy is low and it's very labor intensive. But once I get to fluency, my accuracy should be fairly high. And my goal as an instructor is to make sure that we get you to high levels of accuracy first. That's always the priority. I want you to understand it and I want you to get it right. Once you understand it and you're not making errors, then my goal is to get you more accurate and automatic. So fluency is when that automaticity starts to come in. And so what that looks like is students are not really having to think as long. That information is more retrievable and accessible to them quickly. That still, however, is not mastery. The next stage then is generalization. And generalization is I'm going to maintain accuracy. I'm going to really continue to increase my automaticity and become faster and more automatic. But now I'm really starting to see how that information that I learned is applicable in a more authentic setting. So it's that ability to apply that information out of the context of the lesson in which I learned it in a more meaningful way. That's generalization. And for some students, that's where the breakdown starts to occur, because they may be able to do something in a phonics lesson accurately, but then when it comes to actually reading that same pattern in connected text, teachers will say, I don't understand, they did really well in the lesson, but then when it actually came time to read or write with that pattern, it was like they never learned it before. Often that's because the practice that we provided didn't give structure for helping kids make the connection to what it looks like in an authentic setting. So generalization is a key part for students to be able to acquire that skill and use it from this point forward. But that actually is still not mastery. It's stage 4 adaptation that actually is when a child masters the skill. And the difference between generalization and adaptation is really more about integrating that skill with lots of other skills, and often in a multi-step process. And then really too, when things don't work the way as we expected and we have to do a little problem solving. So an example of that might be, let's say that I've worked with a student to teach them Magic E as a syllable type, and I've taught them that when they see 2 vowels in a word and the vowels fall in this order, 1 vowel followed by 1 consonant and an E, that E is going to jump back over the consonant and make the vowel in front of it say its name. And so they do a really nice job reading Magic E words, and they're in connected text and they're able to read them beautifully. And then they encounter the word G-I-V-E. And they go, okay, that is going to make I say its name, Give, Jive. Doesn't make sense. They have to problem solve. Oh, I'm going to integrate other information that I learned from a different lesson, which is no English word ends in V. It's always followed by a silent E. So perhaps that E is there for another reason, and they have to, again, integrate lots of information and problem solve. That adaptation phase is when mastery happens. The tricky part is we typically don't teach to that phase, and it's not really possible for us to do that. But when we're teaching students many skills and we're helping them get to the generalization stage, then we really just support them through think alouds and error correction, that adaptation where they're integrating information. So I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit more description around how to recognize what phase a student is in, because it's through that process that we'll be able to design our instruction appropriately. So again, what we'll see in acquisition is that error rates are high and responses are very slow and effortful. And students may need a lot of reminders from us, a lot of visuals. Maybe we're pointing to the E at the end of a word to remind them that E is there doing a job. We might be providing verbal prompts like, what is that E doing to the vowel in front of the consonant? So that type of thing is what we might see students need us to do when they're in the acquisition stage. When they've progressed to the fluency stage, what we might start to recognize is that their error rates continue to decrease. They're getting more accurate with each opportunity to practice, but that they might have a hard time distinguishing similar skills. So if we've just recently taught Magic E, they might be overgeneralizing and they think all vowels are long now, and they don't see the difference between cap and cape. So that could be something that we observe in the fluency stage. And even though the responses are more automatic, we probably will still need to provide some error correction for them in our prompts at that stage. We'll be able to recognize the generalization stage when that accuracy continues to improve, the rate in which they respond continues to improve, and they seem to be able to apply that in a more authentic setting with minimal support from us. And then adaptation is really when we're no longer thinking about that skill because they have really just absorbed it into their skill set. So when we recognize the stage a student is in, then we can really think through what are our goals as the instructor to help them get out of the current stage to the next stage. Because again, if we stop that progression of mastery too soon, that's when we begin to see that students have not retained previously learned material. And one of the biggest challenges that we have for students who need Tier 2 and Tier 3 support isn't that they didn't understand the information when it was presented, it was that they didn't retain it. It's almost as if, their brain, if we think about it as a cup, we just kept pouring new information in and that cup just overflows and things start falling out to make room for new. So our really priority for those Tier 2 and Tier 3 students is making sure they don't forget the information that they have acquired. And so that's where this connection to what should our goals be is really important. So when we know students are in that acquisition stage, our goal is to increase accuracy. And the way that we're going to do that is to provide multiple opportunities to practice. And we're going to provide lots of visual and verbal prompts to really help train their retrieval process on what we want them to go through and think through in their steps to acquire that new information. What that practice is going to look like is going to be very intentional based on this level, and I'll illustrate that for you in just a moment. When they're at the fluency stage, our key goals for our students are to continue to increase their accuracy, but now also to increase the automaticity of their retrieval. We want it to be less effortful for them. And we do want them to start to be able to distinguish between similar skills. So that discrimination piece is really important in the fluency stage. In generalization, our key goal is to make sure they don't forget what we taught them. So our focus becomes retention of material so that they can get to that integration of holding on to what I taught them 3 weeks ago so that they can now connect it with what I taught them this week to be able to apply it correctly, that multi-step process. And then in adaptation, we're going to continue to support retention and help them, again, integrate in a multi-step process across more authentic reading and writing tasks. So then if we know what those instructional hierarchy stages are, we really need to think about what's causing some students to pause at a stage and have difficulty moving from one to the next. And this is where information about cognitive load theory can really help us make sense of why that's happening and what we can do to support the students to get to that next stage. So again, on this slide, you're seeing some key researchers that have contributed essential information for us around instructional design based on what we know about how much information children can hold on to and manage at any one time. So that's really cognitive load theory. So let's make sure that we have a general picture of what cognitive load is. So when I talked about that cup, that's really our brain, I'm going to ask you to rethink the cup and think about it instead now as a funnel. So a funnel has the capacity to drain information out so that it doesn't just continue to overflow. So our brain is more like a funnel. Now, what we want the bottom of the funnel to do is to drain things into our long-term permanent memory, not to just let them fall out from the bottom and from the top. So if we think about the funnel, if we overfill the funnel too much, it's going to spill out the top. But a good funnel is going to drain at a nice enough rate that we can keep up with the new information that's coming in. So we need to think about that again, long-term memory and how we're going to get things to long-term memory. We want to reduce the overflow effect. So when we think about the different types of working memory and memory tasks kids have, the capacity of my brain to hold on to and manage multiple pieces of information at one time is my load. It's the load, it's the amount that I can carry. Now there's variables that influence my load. One is the intrinsic load. So my intrinsic load is what I as the learner bring to the table. And so the teacher doesn't have any control over that. That's all personal based on experience, based on the capacity of my working memory, based on how automatic I am at prerequisite skills. So that diversity within a group of students can be pretty extreme. And if I know as a teacher I can't manipulate that, I need to at least know what I'm working with. So this is where pre-assessments can really be helpful to me. My extraneous load, so think extra, it's the extra burden that students are placed in or that we're placing upon students. And sometimes that's environmental. It's environmental perhaps if we're working on a high concentration task in a noisy environment. Or if I put a highly distracted learner by a student who has to talk to themselves out loud, that's probably putting extra load on the student who is really having attention issues. But one thing that we do to put extra load on students that we don't realize we're doing, and we certainly don't intend to do, is our instructional design. We might require multi-steps in a process that students aren't really ready for. We might ask them to engage in a task in which they don't even have the prerequisite skills yet established to be able to use them. So we can control that extraneous load as educators by thinking about environment and by thinking about task that we're putting on a learner. And then germane load really is what we can manipulate more significantly. And that is really all around being very intentional about the activity that we're doing, the directions that we're providing. It's all around taking away as many distractors as we possibly can and emphasizing the key parts of the lesson or the task. So to summarize what we know about cognitive load and how this relates to mastery and why some kids aren't moving through those stages is because we often place too much of a demand on their working memory. We all have a very similar capacity of our working memory. And if we put too much demand on a student's working memory, then they're not going to be successful with the task and they're probably going to make more errors. So these are the things that can increase the demand on a student's working memory. And if we're aware of them, then we can think about whether we can control and manipulate them. So when students do not have the prerequisite skills that they need, that's putting an extra demand on their working memory. So for example, if I'm working with an early reader and they're trying to sound out an unfamiliar word, and they are not really automatic yet on those sound symbol correspondences. They might see the letters M, A, P, but because the prerequisite skills are not fully established yet, they might do something like this. A, and that slow, effortful retrieval, when they go back to blend the word, results in gum. And you go, huh? How did you get the word gum from a? Well, their working memory was taxed, and since they were slow and effortful in their retrieval, by the time they went back to blend those sounds together, the information they needed was gone. So prerequisite skills not yet being mastered, but being required in a task is putting extra cognitive load on students, and it's preventing them from being successful. What that looks like, again, when we know that the prerequisite skills aren't established, we see high error rates, and we see a very effortful, slow, labor-intensive response. Another thing that often causes an overload in working memory is multiple steps. So if we're asking them to do many things, and I'll give you a syllable division example. So if I have a 2-syllable word and I want to have students support and apply what I've taught them about syllable division, I'm going to just verbalize for you the steps that might be involved. I'd like you to underline the vowels. I'd like you to label them V. Then I want you to label the consonants between them C. Then I would like you to divide between the consonants. Please go back and read the first syllable, read the second syllable, and put it together. Well, there will be some students who heard the first thing that you said, but they lost that a long time ago. The only thing they can remember are the last 2 or 3 things that you said. Now, to add to that, the student who didn't even have that accurate and automatic retrieval of what are the vowels is already at a deficit for not being able to participate in the instruction. So when we're thinking about multiple steps and a multiple step process, we can reduce working load or cognitive load if we break that down into small parts. So again, that's part of our instructional design. Another thing that causes cognitive overload is when our modeling of a task does not actually match what it is that we want students to do. So we should be modeling exactly what they're expected to do, because that is reinforcing the visual and verbal prompts that we're going to support them with when they're doing this together and then on their own. And then finally, when the directions are unclear or unfamiliar, and I would probably even add to that wordy. So oftentimes our directions can be a little bit over the top in terms of using too much language. So we need to think about, when we're giving directions, what is best to show visually, what is best to say and verbalize. And oftentimes it's little pieces of the directions that align themselves to one or the other. And so if we can think through our instructional design that way, what happens is then kids don't have to think about the instructions of the task. They can actually think about the task itself and the content that they're trying to learn. So that's really where our knowledge of forms of practice starts to enhance our instruction, and we can be more purposeful about designing that instruction. So moving into the type of practice is really important. And again, the key researchers that have contributed to this knowledge base around practice forms are listed here on the screen. So what do we mean by practice? And really the first thing I would say is just providing more practice is very rarely the solution. We have to think about the type of practice that we're providing. So we're going to examine that from 2 different perspectives. One perspective is around the type, which is the organization, and the other one is around the frequency, or how it's distributed. And each form of practice actually does serve a different purpose. So when we think about type really relates to cognitive load. The type of practice that we're choosing should be based on how skilled is the student with this specific activity. And so am I going to reduce the cognitive load because this is new and they're in the acquisition stage? Or can I increase it because they're good at retrieving it and now we're going to apply it? And so I can increase the demand because they have the prerequisite skills. When I think about frequency, I need to be thinking about, if this is new, they need a lot of practice in a short period of time. But if I want to retain the skill over time, I need to think about distributing practice over an extended period of time, because now our focus is retention. So more practice isn't the same as the right type of practice. When we are really planning our lessons, we're going to come back to what kind of cognitive load can they manage and what's my retention and mastery goal. So I thought it would be helpful to illustrate these 2 concepts with examples that you might be able to use with students. So let's talk about organization first when we talk about forms. So organization could either be broken into blocked practice or interleaved practice. And blocked practice is going to be more beneficial when students are in the acquisition stage and they're starting to move into fluency. Interleaved or mixed practice is going to be more beneficial when students are in fluency and moving into generalization. And I'll show you an example of what those 2 look like. When we think about our timing, we have massed versus spaced. Massed practice is the same amount of practice just condensed down to a short period of time. That would be like the equivalent to cramming for a test. Whereas spaced and distributed would take that same amount of practice, but now instead of condensing it down into a short period, we're going to take that practice and we're actually going to spread it out over time. And so spaced and distributed is going to be more beneficial if I want to retain the skill and not forget it. So let's go back to that organization model for just a moment. So this is an example of blocked practice. What makes it blocked is the fact that each column is really featuring a very specific skill. So if I am a student and I am learning a new phonics pattern like the vowel team OA, then really what I want to do, since that's the new skill, is I want to focus on that new skill. And to make it easier for me to focus and decrease my error rates, I'm going to present that information in a list that's controlled that only contains OA words. And it will also only contain consonant sounds that I've known, that I've already learned, that I've mastered, because my objective is getting accurate and automatic with the new pattern OA. So I would explicitly teach students OA says O. I would tell them the place value. We usually find it at the beginning of a word, which means I should have a word like oak and oat on my list. We also find it in the middle of a word, like in roam and float and cloak and bloat. So this blocked list, in order to support students in this acquisition stage when the information is new and clunky, I can provide additional help by having them do things like underline the new vowel team and just say the sound O, 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 and then go back and read roam, float, cloak, bloat. And the reason I'm doing that is both giving them this blocked, really controlled practice so that their working memory is really not being stretched beyond capacity. But I'm also giving them a form of massed practice, lots of repetition in a short period of time. So this type of blocked, and perhaps we're doing more than one skill in a lesson, I would block all the skills that we're doing in that lesson so that they have that opportunity to really focus on increasing their accuracy. And I may need to provide verbal and visual prompts like the underlining or OA says, and they would repeat that sound. So again, super important in that acquisition stage until our errors have decreased. Once I have gotten students from that acquisition and we're in fluency and we want to progress into generalization, my form of practice in terms of organization is going to change. It's going to shift to what we call interleaved or mixed. So the difference between the previous word list and this word list is you'll see that I still have those same 3 vowel teams that I just worked on, but they're not blocked. They're all mixed together. And so what I'm looking for as an instructor is, can they still be accurate when I've taken away the support of that blocked list? And are they still continuing to get more automatic in reading these concepts? So by interleaving old content with new content or interleaving new content in a less blocked design, I'm actually assessing informally how strong is the student with this skill? And do I need to back up and provide a little more blocked practice? If I only do blocked practice and I don't present information this way, often what happens is we get a false sense of security that students know a skill and they actually don't. What they did is they just got on autopilot and they just said those words with those sounds because they picked up on the pattern. But if they can do this in a more effortful way and still be accurate, then I know that they are much closer to mastery. So this is an important stage, an important practice design to implement with our students. So I'd like to shift gears and talk about the timing component of practice next. So comparing and contrasting the two for just a moment, we have massed, which again, remember massed, if we pretend we've got 40 repetitions, massed would be concentrating them in a short period of time, maybe in the matter of a couple of days. And that's what a lot of core programs do. They provide like a targeted week on a skill, and you really hit that skill hard in a week. But then next week, we have a new skill that we're hitting hard, and we kind of drop off the skill that we learned last week. So massed, short period of time, really targeted and focused. Whereas spaced, so we think of the opposite, we space it out over time. That's also called distributed. So same terms, 2 different terms, same concept. So what I want to share with you is that timing matters too. So if I have a student in the acquisition stage, I want to provide massed practice for them. I want to give them that concentrated practice in a short period of time because they're really clunky and I want to reduce their errors. And I don't want to wait a few days before we practice it again because they'll probably forget it. So I want to do several days with that same skill, lots of opportunities to practice. But once they get accurate and automatic, then I want to make sure that I'm testing that by mixing. So remember that interleaved where we mixed it up? If we mixed it up and they still stayed accurate and automatic, then I know that they're closer to mastery. So now I want to get rid of massed and I want to start doing spaced and distributed practice. I want to start leaving that skill out of my lesson for a day. And then I'm going to put it back in and see if they still remembered it. And then if they did, I'm going to leave it out for 2 days. And then I'm going to put it back in and see if they remembered. So when we distribute that practice over time and they don't forget it, what's happening is we're making that pathway in their brain to retain that information and get it to their long-term memory more effective. So one expression that Anita Archer says that I love, that has always stuck with me, is retrieve, respond, retain. So anytime as a student, you have to retrieve information, you have to go back in your filing system in your brain and pull it out somewhere, that's improving your retention, but only if I ask you to respond. Just thinking about it isn't enough. I need you to either say out loud your answer, I need you to write down your answer, I need you to do some sort of response, some verbal or written response. Because if you retrieve it and then you respond, then you will likely retain. So pulling back old content into our lesson over time is how we improve retention. So if we look at this chart, what it's showing is this percent of correct responses. So if we practice something only 1 to 3 times, and we do it in a massed way, I'm going to be more accurate in massed practice than I am in spaced practice. So already we know, well, hold on, my accuracy is better in massed than it is in spaced. That's why we do massed in acquisition, because isn't our goal in acquisition to improve accuracy? It is. So we're going to align the practice to the instructional goal based on the stage. Since my goal in fluency and generalization is retention, I know that my percentage of retention improves in spaced or distributed. So what I want to tell you about this graph is over time, so we start to see up here in this area of the graph, this is several periods of time later. We start to see that our spaced practice is getting closer to massed. And in some longitudinal studies that have been done, 6 months after a skill has been taught, students who practiced it in a spaced design versus a massed design far exceeded the students who practiced in massed only. So again, since my goal in fluency and generalization is retention, spaced or interleaved distributed practice is the solution for retention. And this is another form of presentation of that study information. So here's what's interesting, and this is probably going to be a little bit more concrete than the earlier slide. So this study was done based on college students. And basically what they did is they taught students the same information and they asked students to study it, just study it. Studying it is retrieving. There's no response unless you write it down or you set it. Studying is completely internal. So the proportion of items that were recalled after the fact, several weeks later in the post-test, was very low if students only studied it. If the students had to recall it one time, that means there was a response. They had to say it or write it. Then their proportion of recall for accuracy was closer to 25%. If they did, instead of just recalling and testing at one time, but massed practice, there's no real difference between lots of practice in a short period of time and recalling it once. However, look at the difference between repeated spaced practice and the other two. So we're looking at 25% retention of accuracy versus 75%. So it's not that one is better than the other, one is more effective than the other, for specific instructional goals. Masked when you're in acquisition, spaced when we want you to retain. Just sharing one more version of that, which is John Hattie's work on spaced practice. One of the findings that he had with a large, in fact, it was significantly large effect size, was daily cumulative review. That's spaced practice. When we teach a skill, we have to keep it in our review. But building on that would be giving time between reviews so that students have to retrieve it more effortfully down the road. So taking this information then, let's put it all together. So how would this really impact how we design and deliver our lessons? Not just for our students in Tier 2 and Tier 3, but what about our universal instruction that all kids are benefiting from? Well, let's go back to cognitive load. If we know that when students do not have prerequisite skills mastered, it already decreases the efficacy of the lesson for them. They're overwhelmed, they're just losing the information. It's overflowing out of their brain. So one of the first things we should be doing is backwards design. So we need to be identifying what are the essential prerequisite skills a student needs to participate effectively in instruction. We also need to be thinking about the task. How can we possibly break it down into smaller steps so that we haven't left students behind before we even get to the end of our directions? We should also be providing visual and verbal prompts to help them retrieve that information when they do block or make an error. And throughout the process, we should be modeling each step, and we should be modeling the step that matches how we want them to practice and implement. And then as a general rule, and these would be the two things that I would ask you to try to take away with you today. One of the most effective things we know from cognitive psychology is if we're teaching a student a new procedure, perhaps we're teaching a new syllable division technique, we should use content they already know. So we shouldn't actually be giving them words that they don't know, that they haven't read before, because we want them to learn the new procedure, and so the content should be familiar. We don't want information competing for space in the brain. So whatever my priority skill is, that takes center stage, and the other things should be familiar. New procedures, old content, because I don't really care if you remember the content. You already know the content. I care that you remember the procedure. And then the opposite would be true if I have new content to teach you. Whenever I'm teaching you new content, I shouldn't approach it from the goal of entertaining you. I should approach it from the goal of making sure you know exactly how this lesson's going to work, that you don't have to pay attention to my directions. You know exactly what to expect. I point to the card, you say the sound. I point to the letters, or you point to the letters, and you drag them together. The procedure should be exactly the same and very consistent and predictable, and not distract from the new content that you're learning. So new content needs old procedures. New procedures needs old content. And that maximizes the impact of the lesson in improving student outcomes. When we think about instructional design as well, we need to make sure that our lessons are explicit. So the guru of explicit lessons and explicit instruction is by far Anita Archer, and that's where her phrase, I do, we do, you do, comes from. And where it comes from, I am going to show you, I am going to take out any guesswork that I'm asking of you. I want to over and inform you of what's happening. I don't want you to draw any conclusions that are inaccurate. I don't want you to walk away with any misconceptions. I am going to make sure that you overlearn this because we want to, out of the gate, prevent any errors. Because if not, students remember what was incorrect more than they remember what was correct. And so explicit instruction prevents errors as much as possible, but it also is by design reducing cognitive load because it's breaking things into small steps. It's modeling all along the process. I'm going to do what you're going to do. We're going to do it together. I'm going to prompt you so that I can support your retrieval. You're going to do it, and I'm going to watch you and give you feedback. So following an explicit instructional design is key for breaking down cognitive load. Then, when we think about how this all connects back to those stages of learning that we started with, when we're thinking about that acquisition stage, when students are really clunky and making a lot of errors, I would challenge you to think about your lesson warm up. So when we do a warm up for a lesson, it shouldn't always be what I taught you yesterday. My lesson warm up should be based on what prerequisite skills are you going to need today, because I want to warm those up for you. And I want to make sure that I know that you have those skills down and that we haven't forgotten some of those prerequisite skills. So acquisition, I'm going to warm you up with prerequisite skills. I'm going to introduce the new skill. I'm going to tell you why it's important. I'm going to provide examples and sometimes not examples, not always. Sometimes not examples are going to add to confusion. So that's something to be really careful about thinking through ahead of time. I'm going to do it. I'm going to demonstrate it. I'm going to narrate for you, again, using those visual and verbal prompts. And I'm going to make sure that exactly what I want you to do is exactly what I'm demonstrating. When we do it together, I'm going to support you with those visual and verbal prompts, because really what I'm doing is trying to train a script in your own brain that you'll be able to use when I'm not there to help you. And then when you do it, you're going to do blocked practice. So that you do in the acquisition stage, blocked masked practice. I want to remove any variables that could add to the capacity that I'm putting on you. I don't want to stretch you beyond what you're able to manage. And I'm going to provide feedback. And feedback can be as much as a head nod. It doesn't have to be visual or verbal clutter. And then when we do our review, we're going to recap. And I'm not going to tell you what we learned. I'm going to ask you to tell me what you learned. Because often when we recap a lesson, we say to the kids, here's what we learned today, and here's what you need to remember. And we just prevented them from having a really effective opportunity to retrieve and respond. So have them tell you what they learned so that you can also clean up any misconceptions. So when we're planning our lessons, we need to think about these two key components. Reduce cognitive load. We'll be consistent with our language. Our instructional routine should be very predictable and very regular. And I know that's counter to what sometimes we've been coached to do, especially when we think about, having a hook and getting kids excited and engaged. Actually, when I am successful, I am excited and engaged. And one of the ways that you can make me be successful is to reduce all of the information that I have to manage at any one time. So it's not about tricking me and motivating me with a hook or something creative and out there that's novel. Familiar is an important way to hook me in because I will be successful. We also reduce cognitive load by giving very concrete examples, breaking things up into steps, giving validation and corrective feedback when needed. And in our explicit instruction, it's always setting kids up for success with I do, we do, you do. Then we need to think about the practice opportunities that we're providing for our students and how we're going to ensure that they have blocked practice where all those distractors are pushed out of the way when we're working on new content at that acquisition stage. And that once my accuracy is there, then we're going to change that practice format to become more interleaved and mixed. And we're going to start mixing in old content with new content to make sure that I didn't lose my accuracy and automaticity. And then we'll be spreading that practice out over time. So I thought it might be helpful to look at an example of what a structured literacy lesson template is really designed to do from this instructional design model and purposeful practice. So this is a little small print to look at. So I believe you have access to the slides. But what I would encourage you to do as you're, kind of looking at this model is think through the opportunities for practice and the design that's happening in a structured literacy lesson. So generally, we begin with a warm-up, and a warm-up could be a phonemic awareness warm-up because I'm going to introduce a new phoneme grapheme card today. Perhaps I'm going to teach you today that the letters SH together produce the sound sh. So what I may need to do before I even hit that skill is warm you up and make sure you're actually hearing that speech sound. So we may do a little phonemic awareness activity where I say, all right, my sound is shh, repeat, shh. Now I'm going to say some words, and when you hear that sound in the word, why don't you say the sound and give me a thumbs up? Push, and the students would say shh, wish, shh. If you don't hear the sound, just give me a thumbs down, thumb, and you're checking for that. So that warmed them up with a prerequisite skill. Then we want to move into that cumulative review of previously learned skills. And so that cumulative review is really distributing over time content that has been introduced that I don't want you to forget. And there's a couple of places that actually happens in a structured literacy lesson. For example, in a visual drill where students see cards and the teacher prompts them to say the sound that is connected with the grapheme on the card. That is spaced practice over time. It's not just concentrating, I'm only doing the cards that I learned this week. I'm doing the cards that I've been exposed to over time. And it's interleaved because the order in which I'm seeing them should vary. In fact, I usually shuffle my cards up on my lap before we do our visual drill so students know, you know these in any order that I present them in. And anytime we're asking students to retrieve previously learned information and it's in a new organization system and we've had periods of rest between them, we're solidifying that retrieve, respond, retain structure that's going on. Another example for distributed practice in a structured literacy lesson is when we do a blending drill, when students have to pronounce those combinations of letters to pronounce syllables, especially nonsense syllables they've never seen before. That's really application and working them towards generalization. An auditory drill is another example of distributed practice and interleaving and mixed organization so that they don't forget over time. It's really when we get into that new instruction and we're teaching a new phoneme grapheme card that we really get into that massed practice structure in a lesson like this. And so we will present the new card. We usually have them skywrite, trace it, do something multiple times because we want them to really get that new skill down. Then we present them with a blocked word list where they have that pattern in isolation and they can really focus on getting accurate with that pattern. So for the most part, if a structured literacy lesson contains all the essential components, you could actually examine and realize that probably 70 to 80% of a structured literacy lesson is interleaved, mixed practice, and distributed or spaced over time. And that's why, especially for students that are having difficulty and are getting tier 2 and tier 3 instruction, that is a critical component of what they're going to need. So as you're identifying students who need additional support, one of the most effective things that you could do is ensure that that lesson is really prioritizing maintenance of previously learned skills, even more so than practice on something new. So minimize the time on new, masked and blocked for new, and increase the time on review of cumulative practice. So those of you who are interventionists and working with students, it's really important because we never have enough time to work with our kids, and we often have to make choices about what to leave and what to reduce. It would actually be better to reduce the amount of time you're spending on new and increase the amount of time in cumulative review. And for those kids that you see have gotten to fluency, but they haven't quite gotten to generalization, that's where we might want to increase our interleave design, mix things up a little bit more, make sure that they're having an opportunity in reading to read decodable text. And based on what we know about kids who are having a hard time moving from one stage to another, since generalization requires integration of many skills, your fluency passage might be better for students if it didn't contain the new skill at all. In fact, if the new skill that I taught today in my lesson is still bumpy for you and you're making errors and you're not automatic, there's no way you're going to be fluent when I mix it in with other content. So taking your passage often back about a week to 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the student, might support them to hit that generalization of the skills that they are now fluent and automatic with. So take that new skill out for students that really seem to be having difficulty. The same would be true in sentence dictation. Consider taking the new skill out of your sentence dictation and base your sentences on content that you know your student is accurate and automatic on. So the more integrated the skill is, the more cognitive load the student is experiencing. So those of you, again, in an intervention setting and you're doing more diagnostic and prescriptive instruction, use what you know about your student and their error patterns to make purposeful decisions about that design. So I did want you to know that the references that I cited as key researchers to examine with those questions are at the end of the slideshow. So I hope that those will come in handy to you. And then some of the graphics on the researchers are also cited here if that is of interest. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I appreciate your time and attention this morning. And I believe I'm going to hand it back over to the staff. And thank you for including me in this great symposium today.